Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, and distinguished participants, I extend a warm welcome to the 15th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture. The 15th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture is being co-hosted by the Institute of Chinese Studies and the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. We are honored to have ThePrint as our media partner for this lecture. It is with utmost respect and admiration that I welcome Professor Tongdong Bai, our esteemed speaker for today's lecture. I also welcome Mr. Ravi Bhutalingam, Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, who will be chairing the session. I also extend a heartfelt welcome to Dr. Hilal Ahmed, Deputy Director of the Center for the Study of the Developing Societies. Before I hand over this session to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow some housekeeping rules. All the participants will be muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box during the event, or you can raise your hand option during the interactive session. Please mention your full name and affiliation while posting your questions in the chat box. After the presentation, you'll be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. So without further ado, I now hand over the floor to the chair, Ravi sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariji. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 15th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture. It is a very great occasion, and we are honored to have as our speaker, Professor Tongdong Bai, whom I will introduce in a few minutes. But before that, a very brief introduction of the Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture, of which this is the 15th. Giri Deshingkar was a pioneer of Chinese studies in India. He was in fact a member, a founder member of the Institute of Chinese Studies in its previous avatar as the China Study Group as far back as 1969. He was a man of many parts, interested in science, strategy, history, linguistics, both classical and modern Chinese. Apart from a great love and expert knowledge of Indian classical music as well as Chinese cuisine. Now, such a combination is very, very rare to come by. And he was indeed a very rare individual. And that is why, to honor him, the Institute of Chinese Studies and the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, of which he was director, have decided to hold this lecture in his memory for the last 15 years. I will not say any more about him. There is a little write-up that has been circulated, but I will now ask Dr. Hilal Ahmed, the Deputy Director of the CSDS, to say a few words, following which I will introduce Professor Tongdong Bai, and we can get started. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhutalingam. And I, on behalf of Center for the Study of Developing Societies, welcome Professor Pai and other guests. It is indeed an honor to say a few things about my former director and colleague, whom I never met, Professor Deshingkar. He was one of India's leading Chinese experts, a philosopher of science and an exceptional scholar on the history of China and India. Born on 5th January 1932 in Kolhapur, Maharashtra, he was educated in Chinese studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and at the Yale University. He taught Chinese language and history at the University of Delhi from 1968 to 1978. He was one of the founder of China Study Group in 1969, for which I think Professor Ravi just mentioned, which later grew into the Institute of Chinese Studies in early 1990s, of which he was subsequently the director. Deshinkar was a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, Delhi in 1971 and became its director from 1987 to 1992. Among the many programs he directed there was the prestigious United Nations University program on peace and global transformation, through which, together with Professor Raini Kothari, the founder of CSDS, he contributed a new civilizational and humanistic perspective on peace and people's security. As a key leader of the Chinese Studies program, he played the crucial role in bringing scholars from various universities together and training young colleagues in multidisciplinary, historical, and contemporary studies on China, a task he was uniquely qualified to perform. He had published numerous research papers in various academic journals and books. A frequent commentator on current development, he contributed to the shaping of an informed Indian opinion on China. He was the founder editor of the journal called China Report that was founded in 1964, and its editor again in the time of his untimely death. He passed away on 2nd November 2000. So this is actually a formal introduction to Professor Deshinkar. He is known as Giri Sahab in CSDS. But this formal introduction would become more meaningful if I read out what Raini Kothari has written about him in a book which came out after his death. And the book was based on the collection of his essays and edited by Professor Manoranjan Mohanty and Professor Meera Singh. Let me just read out what Raini Kothari had to say about him, because that's a different facet of his personality. I quote Raini Kothari. He said, "I have, of course, all along held that the central role of political science is to be found in providing fundamentals to both governing structures and ideas, both at home and more broadly globally." Giri, as he was known to him, provided a distinctive contribution in giving to scholarship, both regional and international, a role and perspective that were considerably independent and which made him a leading exponent of independent thinking on both vantage points. All of these making him one who may have started being just an area specialist, but who was given to become an at once original and distinguished scholar at large. So these are Raini Kothari's words. I stop here and over to you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you very much. That was really a really comprehensive account of Giri, as a number of us knew him. Well, it is no wonder that the Giri Deshingkar series of memorial lectures has attracted and drawn foremost personalities in China studies around the world. And it is therefore only fitting that today we have another such expert, Professor Bai Tongdong, whom I shall introduce just now. I will not attempt to read out your CV, Professor Bai, because it is quite long. But just to summarize, that you are currently the Dongfang Chair Professor at Fudan University. You are also Adjunct Professor at the New York University campus there in Shanghai. You have a number of books to your credit in the field of philosophy, Chinese philosophy and comparative philosophy. And most interestingly, I found one of your books deals with Einstein, Bohr, and Pauli. And I was quite interested in that because at some time in the dim past, I too studied physics. What is going to be really very fascinating for all of us is the subject that you are going to lecture on, one that would really have fascinated Giri Deshingkar. The title of your lecture is Liberal Democracy and Confucianism, Creating a Hybrid for the 21st Century. In this, I think you will attempt to really tackle and answer some very difficult questions. How can liberal democracy be improved in this age of science and technology, where perhaps meritocracy has a larger place? Will such improvement actually improve liberal democracy, or could it have the potential of damaging it? There are many complexities to navigate. And finally, people are quite sensitive about the whole subject of democracy in many different parts of the world. I'm sure you have faced many audiences of various sorts in your dealing with this subject. So without more ado, may I invite you now to deliver your lecture for about 45 minutes or thereabouts, and after that we will have questions. Over to you now, Professor Bai.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. And it's really an honor to be able to give a talk here to share my ideas with my colleagues and fellow travelers of Chinese intellectual thought. It's kind of curious, Dr. Ravi, you said you studied physics before. I studied physics as well, and my PhD thesis was really in philosophy of physics. So in that sense, maybe it's also in the spirit of Professor Deshingkar, who seems to have interest in philosophy of science as well. But I've been moving to political philosophy and Chinese philosophy, and today's lecture is based on 3 chapters on my book, Against Political Equality, The Confucian Case by Princeton University Press. I think the paperback came out in 2021. Before I go into the talk, I want to make some clarifications. Nowadays, maybe not this year, but in the recent decade, people have been promoting the so-called China model. So basically, the idea that there's an alternative model of development that China can offer. Put it in slightly more dramatically, we can say China to save the world. So I want to clarify at the very beginning that I'm a philosopher. I don't know why China has developed so rapidly in past 3-4 decades. I mean, I have my own ideas, but it's just my not so educated guess. So what I'm going to focus on is not how China to save the world, rather how Confucianism can save the world. And this is what I've been doing since I graduated from Boston University more than 20 years ago. And to put it another way, sometimes I said, I'm saying that what I'm doing is to make Confucianism great again, to follow the motto of a previous president of the United States. So it's the lecture is really on how, following some Confucian ideas, we can discover some alternative political models that can address today's issues better than the dominant liberal democratic models. So before I go into this topic, again, I have to clarify what I mean by Confucianism. We know Confucianism is a rather long tradition, and you can basically find whatever thinker with whatever ideas in this long tradition. So really by Confucianism, I meant ideas I discovered in the Analects, Confucius Analects, and the Mencius, the book by another important Confucian thinker, Mencius. I think these two texts have relatively coherent messages to offer. The Analects is very short, very brief, and the Mencius is sort of like an elaboration of ideas in the Analects in many aspects. So put it in a different way, Mencius is sort of like the teaching assistant for Confucius. So he elaborated on a lot of the ideas Confucius introduced. Another thing I like to emphasize is that nowadays, when I think the mainstream scholars, when they study Confucianism, they tend to emphasize the ethical or the moral metaphysical aspect of Confucianism. But my focus is really the political aspect of Confucianism, because to me, if you look at how Confucianism got started, Confucius, Mencius, and another early Confucian thinker, Xunzi, they all lived in the transitional period of Chinese history, the so-called Zhou-Qin transition, from the collapse of Western Zhou dynasty to the rise of the Qin dynasty. Another term for this transition is the spring, autumn, and warring states periods. And in this transitional period, the dominant issue is really a political issue, namely how to restore order. When the old order collapsed, the new order hasn't emerged yet. So to me, Chinese philosophy started out primarily as a political philosophy, and ethical or moral metaphysical issues only came as secondary to the political issues. Then what is the nature of this transition? So in my book and some other places, I argue that the transition China experienced roughly from 770 BCE to 221 BCE, 500 years of chaos. What China experienced in this period is a form of early modernization. So China, in a way, entered early modernity 2,000 years before the Europeans did. Why do I say that? Because if you have to find something similar in the European history to the Zhou-Qin transition, I think the best case you can find is the European transition to early modernity. The Western Zhou Empire before this transition was a feudal empire. So it was organized on the principle of feudalism. Of course, feudalism is a very controversial term, but by feudalism I really mean that you run a state through nobles, hereditary nobles, and you divide a large empire up by outsourcing the job of ruling to some lesser nobles, and lesser nobles to some even lesser nobles. I think that's how the Western Zhou Empire run such large a piece of land, a great population. But that regime collapsed around 770 BCE, right? And then all these feudal lords were fighting for domination. And eventually, in the so-called warring states period, starting roughly around 450 BCE, in the warring states period, 7 strong states emerged. Each of the 7 strong states has occupied a large piece of land, has thousands, perhaps millions of subjects, right? And but they didn't dare to use feudalism anymore because they didn't want to give power to some other people because other people will use this power to usurp the power of the ruler. So I think that's the political situation early Chinese thinkers faced, namely how to establish order in the populist, more or less equalized, egalitarian, right? Because now there are no nobles anymore. People are born to be equal. So how you establish order in the populist, plebeianized or egalitarian and mobile society of strangers. I think this is the political reality, and this reality is very much, in my view, similar to the reality of the European transition to modernity. And there are three issues that need to be answered in this context, right? First, who should be rulers? Second, for such a large society of strangers, how you can bond them together? Because for any political entity, there has to be some kind of bonding. And thirdly, how you deal with state-state relations. Okay, and so in my book, with regard to the last two questions, the bonding and state-state relations, I introduced the so-called Confucian new Tianxia model, which offered alternative to the nation-state model and the cosmopolitan model that are offered by the Western thinkers and Western politicians. I think that model can address the challenge of globalization better than the nation-state model and the cosmopolitan model. But this talk is not about that issue. So I'll skip that issue. If you're interested, feel free to take a look at those chapters, chapter 5 to 8 on my book. Rather, in this lecture, I'm going to focus on the first issue, namely who should be rulers. We're using today's term, political legitimacy. Because when nobility collapsed, people are born to be equal. If we are all equal, why should you be the ruler, right? Why should you be a member of the ruling class? I think that's the issue. One of the issues Confucians try to answer, and by elaborating on their answers, I'll show what ideal regime they have envisioned, and then I'm going to show why their ideal regime is better than the mainstream liberal democratic regime, in particular, the institution of one person, one vote. Okay, and let me just make one last clarification before I go into the real content. We use the term liberal democracy as if it is one thing, but really there are two conceptual components, right? The liberal part and the democratic part. So to put what I'm trying to propose very simply, my own conviction is that the liberal part is the part I want to conserve. The democratic part, first of all, conceptually, the liberal and the democratic are conceptually different. And in reality, they are often come in conflict, right? We see the rise of right-wing populism in a lot of democratic countries. And when the populist governments rise, they target at constitutions, rule of laws, human rights, and things like that. I think so. We see that really the liberal part of liberal democracy and democratic part of liberal democracy are in conflict, both conceptually and in reality. Then I think if that is the case, we have to make a choice. Do you want to preserve the liberal part or the democratic part? My proposal is that I want to preserve the liberal part, but in order to preserve the liberal part of liberal democracy, we have to put limits on democracy. So limit democracy in order to save liberalism. So that's a simple summary of what I'm trying to do. Okay, and so now let's go to Confucianism. And so, as I said, Confucius and Mencius lived in a time when equality emerged. people were born to be equal. And of course, if Confucius and Mencius were philosophers, they had freedom to choose to embrace this reality or reject this reality. And especially Mencius, it's quite clear that he embraced this equality. He was asked whether anyone can become a sage Yao or sage Shun, Yao and Shun being two sages, ideal sages for Confucians. So basically, he was asked whether anyone can become this ideal human being. And his answer is a very clear and simple yes. Okay, so for Mencius, everyone has the equal moral potential to become the ideal human beings, right? Then, if everyone can become this moral ideal, why should someone be rulers, someone else be the people who are ruled, right? Before we go into this issue, let's first discuss what's the role of government for early Confucians, right? And in the passage of the Mencius, he gave a account of history, but I think Mencius is a philosopher. We shouldn't trust philosophers too much when they talk about history. So in my view, when Mencius talked about history, he really meant to demonstrate his ideal world, right? So in his ideal world, under the sage ruler Yao, people were suffering from all sorts of dangers, wild beasts, flooding, and things like that. And the sage ruler Yao worried about this. So he appointed people to control the flooding, to drive away the beasts, right? And then he also appointed people to teach people how to do agriculture. Okay, so apparently in this passage, Mencius suggests that the first order of business of the government is to offer the material well-being to the people. Okay, but then he said, when people have a comfortable home, clothing, a comfortable living, but if they don't have proper moral education, if they don't have proper human relationships, they almost degenerate into the form of beasts, non-humans. Therefore, sage ruler Yao started worrying again, and he appointed someone to teach people how to deal with the so-called 5 basic human relationships: father, son, husband, wife, older brother and younger brother, ruler and subject, and friends. Okay, and so if we sum up what Mencius was trying to say in this passage, what he was trying to say here is that the government should be responsible for the material and moral well-being of the people. Without the moral education offered by a qualified government, we human beings do not necessarily live like humans. So I think an implication here that for Mencius, human being is not a biological concept, rather it's a moral and relational concept. Without proper morality and proper relations, even if someone looks like a human being, he or she is not a human being. But in this passage, Mencius or Confucians are often accused of being overly moralistic, because he suggested that without moral education, we are just a society of beasts, not a society of human beings. However, in this passage, it's quite clear the ruler has to address people's material needs first. In another passage, he's even more explicit. He said that for the common people, if they don't have a proper means of support, they wouldn't have proper minds. So basically, what he's saying is that if people don't have property, they wouldn't have morality. If the government fails to offer basic needs to the people, then people will commit crimes. Then if the government arrests people for committing crimes out of necessity, the government actually really set up a trap for the people. So that's entrapment, if we use a legal term. So although for Mencius, what is essential to for someone to be a human is the moral character but for the government, you need to take care of the material needs of the people first. Okay, so that's governmental duties. Then, even if government is supposed to have these duties, if government doesn't have accountability, all these duties are just empty, right? If the government doesn't do its duties, but it doesn't get punished, then the government can still do whatever it wants to do. And the mentions again is quite clear that government should be held accountable to satisfying people's material needs. So in another passage, he was asked about people, how the next ruler. He called him the son of heaven, because for the Chinese back then, we thought that the world we lived in was the whole world, right? Then the ruler of the Chinese Empire is really the ruler of the whole world, or sometimes it's called all under heaven, right? And so the ruler of all under heaven is the son of heaven. So he was asked, how the next son of heaven, the next ruler, is selected. Mencius says, it cannot be selected by any particular man, including the previous son of heaven. Rather, heaven has to appoint the next son of heaven, but heaven doesn't speak. So eventually, he says, heaven sees with the eyes of its people, heaven hears with the ears of its people. So basically, heaven makes decisions through people's eyes and people's ears. Okay, and so I think here it's quite clear that the ruler has to be responsible for people's happiness, right? And then if the ruler fails to do his or her duty, then the ruler can be removed. Because in another passage, Mencius asked a king, one of the kings of the 7 strong states. He asked the king, King Xuan of Qi, he asked this king, if, hypothetically speaking, if I'm traveling abroad, I asked a friend to take care of my family. Yet when I return from this long trip, my family suffers from hunger, even death. What should I do with this friend? The king said, break up with him, right? Obvious. And then Mencius asked a similar case. Finally, he asked the king, what if under a king, the people suffer from hunger and death? What should we do with the king? And the answer by analogy is quite obvious, right? But the king doesn't want to say, if I don't do a good job, I should be removed, right? And if you have read the Mencius, you will see that Mencius is really a very uptight, serious person. But in the book of the Mencius, I think this is one of very few places there's some kind of humor involved, right? So the king is supposed to say, if I don't do a good job, I should be removed. But clearly he doesn't want to say it. So instead, in the text, it's recorded that the king looks around and changes the topic, right? But you can imagine the king is really pissed by Mencius. And so 2 passages later, he came back. He asked Mencius, okay, you Confucians are a bunch of loyalists. In the 20th century, there are a lot of anti-traditional Chinese politicians and thinkers. And their impression of Confucianism is nothing but an underling of traditional Chinese despotism. And the king seems to have a similar impression. So he said, you Confucians are a bunch of loyalists, but how you celebrate 2 people who overturned their own kings? In one case, one person killed the king and became a king himself, right? So if you Confucian are a bunch of loyalists, how can you condone regicide, the illegal, illegitimate killing of the king, right? And Minsh answered that the king that was killed, King Zhou, although he has the title of the king, he doesn't do his job. People suffer under him. Therefore, to kill him is not regicide, rather the killing of a mere fellow. And the term mere fellow actually in the Chinese language became later identical with tyrant, a mere fellow. So we Confucians are against regicide. We Confucians are against the killing of a proper king, a king that does his job, namely serves the people. But if the king doesn't serve his people, then he's not a real king anymore. Then demoting him or even killing him can be endorsed by the Confucians. So by far, Confucians might sound quite democratic, right? The government exists to serve the people, and if it doesn't serve the people, the government can be removed, can be replaced, right? I think the only thing that's not, typical democratic is that for Mencius, the government should be responsible for the moral education, basic moral education of the people as well, right? So some people then argue that, we Confucians have been democrats for 2,000 years, right? Because we have all these apparently democratic ideas. However, if you read the passages I mentioned closely, nowhere did Mencius say that people make the choice of the next ruler, right? People's satisfaction is the determining factor of whether government is doing a good job or not. But people's satisfaction itself is not sufficient for choosing the next government, the next regime, the next ruler. Instead, in another passage, he argues that there should be a division of labor. There are those who labor with their hands. There are those who labor with their minds. Those who labor with their minds rule, the so-called 大人, great people. And those who labor with their hands should be ruled, 小人, the small people, the petty people, right? And maybe people in the audience might be happy to hear this because we are all, most of us are intellectuals, right? We labor with our minds. But I think that's just a loose way of speaking. For Mencius, the real difference is really whether you develop you make effort to develop your morality so fully and your intelligence so fully that you are able to take care of other people and you are willing to take care of other people, right? Because right after this claim, he mentioned the sage ruler Yu, another sage ruler, and he worked physically very hard to control the flood. So although he worked with his hands and feet, he is a member of the ruling class. So for Mencius, there's although at the beginning we all have the same potential to become sages, the morally ideal people, yet in reality, only the few can make it. Only the few can develop their moral and intellectual potentials fully. And those people should become rulers. Okay, so if we use President Lincoln's terminology, right, democracy is of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think we can make a case that clearly Confucians argue that the government should be for the people. Whether the government or the state is by the people or not, that's debatable, but we can still make a case for it. But it's quite clear that Confucian, early Confucians, Mencius in particular, rejects the idea that the government should be by the people. Namely, people should have the only and final say on governmental matters. People's voice plays a role, yet common people are morally and intellectually not capable of making decisions that are good for all the people of the state. Okay, in that case, the morally exemplary people, 君子 or the gentlemen, they should be given more power of making political decisions. Okay, so that's the Confucian political ideal, right? So it's some kind of mixture of popular will and the decision power of the, for lack of a better term, of the meritocrats, people with certain intellectual and moral merits. And so in that sense, it's clearly different from the democratic regime that relies ultimately only on one person, one vote, right? And then now we see the difference. Next question is why the Confucian kind of mixed the regime, mixing the popular element with the meritocratic element. Why this mixed regime is a better regime? To show that, I'll show there are 4 fundamental problems of democracy. There are structural and theoretical problems. Although I'm going to use some real-world examples, yet I think these problems are structural or theoretical. They have nothing. They are not necessarily bound with a particular liberal democratic state, right? So I think there are 4 problems with democracy. First of all, democracy often carries this kind of belief that people can make the best decisions. And by implication, oftentimes in democratic countries, there is a strong suspicion, even resentment of the establishment. I think this kind of anti-establishment or anti-elitist sentiment is the strongest in the U.S. So as a result, there is really a strange and very disturbing phenomena in this kind of anti-elitist, anti-establishment movement. Namely, a lot of American politicians ask people to vote for them, to send them to Washington in order to destroy Washington, because Washington is the establishment is evil, right? Trump said he's going to try to clear the swamp. Washington D.C. is a swamp, is a dirty place, is a chaotic place. But if you think about it, that's really a self-defeating logic, right? Just vote for me, send me to Washington D.C. so that I can destroy Washington D.C. Right? So send me to a place I despise. So as a result, I think interestingly enough, in a survey, Americans respect the most popularly elected branches, the Congress, the least. Rather, they respect the Supreme Court and the military much more than the Congress. But Supreme Court and the military are not through public elections, at least not directly, right? And it seems to be strange, but if you understand the logic of the mentality beneath one person, one vote, and this strange phenomena can be easily explained, right? So that's really a general ideological cultural issue. Then more concretely, the second problem with one person, one vote is that in a regime that ultimately relies on popular vote, all policies are held to hostage of the voters, right? However, the policies of every state oftentimes have implications to people who are not voters. For example, foreigners and future generations. I think one good example is climate change, right? Climate change oftentimes means that we can pollute as much as we want. We can emit CO2 as much as we want. But when there's a global warming, when the sea level rises, we can protect our country by building dams and things like that. And those countries in Pacific Islands, right? They suffer, but they don't have vote. They cannot change our behaviors, right? And also, future generations will pay the price for the CO2 emissions we have made in this generation. But future generations don't have votes, right? And so I think in a democratic framework, it's very difficult to address issues that are concerned with long-term interests, like climate change, like federal deficit. Right? So that's the second issue. The third issue, even among voters, there some of them are more powerful, some of them are less so, right? So oftentimes in a recent democratized state, the first thing that happens is ethnic cleansing. The majority tries to get rid of the minority. Okay, so in a liberal democratic state, where there is a rule of law, human rights, so the minority will not be persecuted directly, but they will be suppressed in a more hidden manner, right? So that's the third issue. And finally, even among the voters whose voice can be heard, I think a fundamental assumption of democracy is that if everyone votes rationally, if everyone votes for his or her short-term material interests, when we put all the votes together, we have the common good. So democracy really presupposes the rationality of average voters. But there are more and more political science and political philosophy literatures that show that the idea of rational voter is nothing but a myth, right? Many voters, maybe the majority of voters are not rational at all. And in my book, I offer two more arguments why it's so hard for voters to be rational. Because first of all, as already mentioned, a key feature of modern state is that it is large and populous. In a large and populous state, it's very hard for a voter to know whether a national policy is good for him or not, right? Whether invading Iraq is good for me or not. It's very hard to know, right? And on top of this, the political matters are already way too complicated for common people to understand. But on top of this, people are busy, right? Because in most modern states, most people have to work day in and day out, right? So they don't have time to think about the very complicated political matters. So no wonder they often make decisions that are bad, even for their own self-interest, let alone for long-term interest, like climate change. And to put this issue even to a more extreme degree, a political scientist, Russell Harding, once argued that if you're rational, you should never vote, because in a large and populous state, one vote never matters. Okay, and but even if you vote, you shouldn't think too much before you vote, because even if you spend a lot of your free time and dedicate yourself to vote responsibly, your vote is just as is equal to the vote of your neighbor who doesn't think too much, who just votes very arbitrarily. So in that case, why bother to be responsible? Because your responsibility will be balanced out by all the irresponsible votes. So so if we are rational, even if we have time, we shouldn't spend too much time thinking about how to vote, because our one vote never matters, right? And most people even don't bother or don't have the time to think carefully about politics. And I think this is why through this kind of one person, one vote mechanism, we often end up with very bad policies. Then how to address this issue? Now we see the beauty of the Confucian mixed regime, right? Because on the one hand, people's voice still plays a role, right? On the other hand, Confucians have reservations about the intellectual and moral capacities of the people, right? Therefore, people's voice should be checked by those who are intelligent and morally responsible, right? And I think that's really the Confucian design. And then how to put this design into something concrete, right? I think, on the local level, on a very local level, my argument against the effectiveness of democracy doesn't really hold, right? Because the most important argument I make is that people are not rational. But in a small local community, people know their neighbors very well, and they can make decisions that are good for themselves, right? So on a very local level, I think people should be allowed to vote. Or put it more precisely, one person will vote should be the only mechanism to decide on local matters, right? But on higher levels, when political matters become too complicated for the common people who are very busy to decide, and then the voice of the meritocrats should be introduced, right? And so how do we design this? How do we identify the meritocrats, right? So in my book, I propose three mechanisms, right? So basically, on the level above the local communal level, I argue that maybe you should have two houses of the legislature, right? Just like the American Senate and the House. We have two houses of the legislature. The lower house is popularly voted in by the people to represent the will of the people. They are literally representatives of the will of the people. And then there's the upper house. The upper house should be consisting of members with moral and intellectual capacities, right? Then how do you identify these people? One mechanism I propose is that maybe we can ask legislators one level lower to vote for members of the upper house one level up, because legislators, they already engage in politics. Oftentimes legislators are full-time legislators, so they have time to think about politics, right? So the members of our upper house can be selected, even elected by legislators one level lower, right? The second mechanism is the kind of traditional Chinese exam system, the Keju exam system, right? You examine the moral and intellectual qualities of the upper house. Of course, it's not that easy to design exam that can identify people with moral merits, right? But at least we can use exams as qualifications, right? So, for example, we can require candidates for the upper house to pass exams in order to become candidates. One exam a friend suggested to me is, for example, the American Foreign Service exam, right? In order to become a diplomat, you have to take the Foreign Service exam. And so, especially in the American case, senators are supposed to vote on international policies, right? So if that's their duty, they should at least know where Iraq is before they vote on the war against Iraq, right? So they should pass certain exams. Okay, and the third mechanism is this. Again, I think to identify people's moral merits is very difficult. Confucian had a lot of troubles in the past with this. Although I think it's very difficult to identify people's morals, yet we can identify some proxies. Proxies for people's morality. For example, again, using the American political setting, if someone is the governor of a state for 2 terms, right, and he or she has the approval rating of 40%, and has no criminal has not been caught with criminal activities, right? Then this person, because his moral and intellectual capacities have been proven in the 2 terms of service in his state, then this person can be sent to the Senate for 1 term, 10 years, but no re-election, so that he or she doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. Rather, he or she can make decisions out of his own or her own cognizance and moral concerns. Okay, so these are the three mechanisms, and these mechanisms can be complementary with each other. Okay, and so that is the design. I think to have more meritocratic elements, maybe you can address the issue of the uninformed, immoral voters having too much say in political matters, to prevent the rise of populism, right? So this is the design, and so I know my time is about to be up. So let me just say a few words on possible challenges to my design, right? And one challenge is that this kind of design reinforces the status quo, right? Because if you look at the American past, Black people are often required to take an exam in order to vote, but that's just a ruse for the white people to exclude the Black people from voting, right? And to this challenge, my answer is that the Confucian mixed regime has to presuppose equal opportunities, and equal opportunities guaranteed by the government. So the government should offer basic goods to the people, should offer universal education and universal healthcare, so that people don't have to worry about those things. And the Confucian regime can also incorporate some suggestions by Western liberal theorists. For example, one proposal is that the day of election should be a holiday. In the U.S., the day for voting for president is a Tuesday, which is not a holiday. So it basically prevents a lot of working people from voting, right? Gives too much power to the rich and the retired people, right? So the voting day should be a holiday. And even better, before voting, people should be paid to have one actual holiday to discuss political matters, right? So all these mechanisms should be there in order for this meritocratic design now to become a hidden way of preserving the status quo, right? And another challenge related to this is that this kind of meritocratic design doesn't facilitate civil friendship. So a good thing about popular vote is that by voting, we can develop civil friendship. We can improve people's competence on making political decisions. Okay, but reality shows that in spite of so many years of popular voting, people's competence doesn't seem to be improved, right? Moreover, in my design, there's still the voting part. It's just that the voting part is not the only determining factor. There is some other, there's another factor, right? So people still can vote, can train their political capacities, can develop civil friendship. The only difference is that nowadays people have a role model to look up to, right? So if you don't spend too much time on political matters, you can only vote for the lower house. But if you want to get involved in the upper house, you should be more morally and intellectually responsible and capable, right? And so I think it still has the civil friendship component, but it has a direction. It's not any friends count, rather friends, friends with a benefit, right? Friends with a sort of moving up, a role model benefit. Another challenge, so there are a few. So maybe let me just focus on one more, then I'll just stop. So some people say, this kind of hybrid mixed regime violates legitimacy and equality. But to this challenge, my question is, why a hybrid regime is not legitimate. I think people who are making this accusation presuppose that only a popularly elected government is legitimate. But why that is the case, right? Why only public election renders legitimacy, right? Another issue is equality. In my design, there are mentions quite clear, right? There are the great people, there are the small people. Great people rule, small people are ruled, right? So there is the kind of violation of equality. But equality, is really a very murky concept. What kind of equality? Because in the Confucian design, people still are equal with regard to their potentials, and government is responsible for helping people to actualize their potentials, right? So the only part that the Confucian hybrid regime is not equal is that people cannot. The popular vote is not the only determining factor anymore. Rather, the meritocrats have a bigger voice in the political decision-making process, right? So put it in another way, John Rawls, the American political theorist, a defender of equality. His first political principle is political equality. In spite of this fact, he, in his Law of Peoples, in the book of Law of Peoples, never listed the right, the one person, one vote as a basic human right, right? Instead, actually, in his theory of justice, he introduced an interesting principle called difference principle. Although he's a kind of egalitarian, he argues that economic inequality can be tolerated if the worst off benefit from this economic inequality the most. So if egalitarian can accept that kind of economic difference principle, then why can't we accept a political difference principle? Namely, some people can political inequality can be tolerated. Namely, some people give more power of political decision making. That political equality can be tolerated if the worst off can benefit the masses, the common people can benefit from this political different arrangement the most. So I think my design is only in conflict with a radical understanding of equality, a radical understanding of legitimacy. So even I think John Rawls could embrace my design, right? So it's not as conflicting with liberal democracy as it first appears to be, but it does solve the problems in the structure of democracy. So I call it a more realistic utopia. So it's kind of utopia. It's not a reality, but it's more realistic. Okay, and so I'll just stop here. I'll listen to your criticisms on my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pai. That was a really fascinating presentation, which I'm sure had all of us really spellbound and listening very intently as you developed the argument. Now, let me ask Arijit, are there any questions in the chat box? Have people posted any questions in the chat box, or failing that on the YouTube channel?
Not that I can see, sir.
So
nothing as of now.
Okay, so whilst people are thinking about their questions,
we can see a raised hand, Ravi sir. Sorry to interrupt.
Is there a raised hand?
Yes,
okay.
Keshav Padmanabhan.
Yes, Mr. Padmanabhan, could you ask your question, please?
Yes. Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Keshav. I'm from ThePrint. And my question to Professor Bai is, in the hybrid system and the argument that you have developed, the one thing that is not clear is on this right to recall. For example, we have democratic elections once every 5 years, 4 years to change the rules, right? So in your argument for the hybrid system, how would you see change in, say, the upper house sort of brought out when you don't have timed elections every 4 years, 5 years, or however? So how do you see that?
Right. So there's still term limit for the upper house. So as I mentioned, if you're governor of a state for 2 terms, then you can be sent to the Senate for 1 term only, 10 years. After 10 years, you're done, you're finished. I think the emphasis is really on 1 term because my worry that people don't necessarily make good decisions. But when you have a politician has to cater for the voters, he or she doesn't have doesn't necessarily make decisions that he or she considers good for the people. Rather, he or she will make decisions that appears to be good to the people. So I think the upper house has to be free from constant elections. But there should be a term limit, right? So that's why I said, just after 10 years, automatically this Senate will be dissolved. We need to select the next bench of senators. Thank you.
The next question, can you read it out, Arijit?
Yes,
I think it is from Ambassador Kanta.
So Ambassador Kantha has written, Professor Bai, I heard your lecture intently. You offered the proposition that Confucianism or a hybrid Confucian model can save the world. Since Confucianism originated in China, let's explore how Confucianism can save China. I have 3 questions. 1, you referred to the concept of what can be described in modern vocabulary as political legitimacy. In the Confucian framework, what is the source of legitimacy of the Communist Party of China and its monopoly of political power? 2, can the Communist Party of China be removed if it loses the mandate of heaven or satisfaction of the people under the Confucian construct you described? 3, you prioritized liberalism over democracy, which has serious structural deficiencies in your assessment, and offered a hybrid model. Is this Confucian hybrid regime applicable to the present day China?
Okay, thank you for all these questions. Obviously, I cannot answer those questions very directly. I still want to teach in China. And so let me just try to answer your question as much as I can. About legitimacy, I think Confucian mentions is quite clear. If government doesn't serve the people, then government can be removed. So the legitimacy of the government comes from the service to the people. The failure to offer service means, really the end of a regime. So I think in theory it is quite clear. Right, and then right. So it is, hybrid regime applicable to contemporary China? I would argue this hybrid regime is applicable to any country in the world. So although I'm using Confucian ideas, I try to present them in a universal manner. So their arguments, their concerns are universal human concerns. If that's the case, and if their argument is right, then their ideal regime should be ideal, not only for Confucians, not only for the Chinese, but for anyone in the world. And not to directly answer your question, but to somewhat answer your question in a different way, I think what comes closest to my proposal in reality is not in contemporary China. It's not even in traditional China. Rather, is the American regime at its founding. The so-called Federalists, the American founding fathers, they too worried about the lack of moral and intellectual capacities of the common people. So they designed the regime in such a way that it will prevent people from having too much say in political decision-making process. For example, in the U.S., when the regime is founded, the senators are elected by state legislators, just like the first mechanism I proposed, right? So members of the upper house are voted by legislators one level lower, right? And the president was elected by electors. So each state votes for electors. Electors then, on their free will, vote for the president, right? And nowadays, the the U.S. still has electors, but the electors now have to vote along the popular law of the state, right? And I think all these designs are meant to check and balance the voice of the people. Of course, there are a lot of injustices in the American founding regime. For example, slavery. For example, exclusion of women from public elections. I think when the Americans try to get rid of those elements, unfortunately, at least to me, they got rid of, I think, the good elements of the design, the hybrid, the meritocratic design. And so I think that fact that the American founding regime could resemble my proposal shows that my proposal is not limited to the Chinese. Rather, it could be applicable to different people, and this idea could, different people could come up with these ideas. I think that it shows the universality of these ideas. Okay, so this is my no answer to your very important questions. Thank you.
So we had one. Sorry, Ravi sir, we had one raised hand from Mohammed Yasin, but it's I can't see it anymore. So we can proceed to the next hand raised by Shruti Jargad. Oh, it's there. I think Mr. Yasin is there to raise his question.
Right. Yes, Mr. Yasin, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Tongdong Bai. I am Mohammad Yasin, a PhD candidate at Jawaharlal Nehru University. I have very recently attended Confucius Summer Studies program in Tanyang City, Jiangsu province. There were professors of Chinese philosophy, including Professor Roger Arms, Professor Tianchen Chan of University of Hawaii, Professor George Moeller of University of Macau, and Sohun Than of Singapore Management University. So Professor Roger remarked that how Chinese philosophy differed from Victorian philosophy of institutionalism and utilitarianism. And Tao is very important. He says way seekers than truth seekers. So even in the Latin expression, which is veritas, or Indian philosophy, Satyam Jayate, the truth triumphs. So basically what I understood, if I'm not mistaken, that Chinese philosophy prefers order, Li. So if there is order and there's no truth, how would you like to see it? And my second question would be, while you are talking about democracy, are you only talking about functional democracy like the US or India? Or do you also include relatively more evolved democracy in countries like Switzerland? And my last question is that you mentioned that the king could be removed. Is it hypothetical? Because it removed in meritocracy. So is it mere hypothetical, or is there a way out as it is there in democracy? We can vote the person out. So thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. First of all, the summer school, from what I heard, is Professor Roger Ames and his former students, Sohun Tan was a doctoral student of his. And by the way, just to do a little bit self-promotion, I'm running a master program in Chinese philosophy with courses taught English. So if any of you or anyone you know wants to study Chinese philosophy with courses taught offered in English, feel free to contact me. We are supported very well by the government. So actually, Rigid is a recent graduate from the program. So so we have financial support. So please feel free to join us. And then really about Professor Roger M's view of Chinese philosophy. I think he represents a special, a particular understanding of Chinese philosophy. I think there's, I agree with him to some extent. Chinese philosophy started out not paying too much attention to the issues of ontology or epistemology. Rather, Chinese philosophy started out mostly as a practical philosophy concerned with politics. So order, that is a very important issue. And I would argue that, Western philosophy, political philosophy, doesn't pay enough attention to the issue of order or governance. It's always, justice, legislation, and things like that. But still, I think there are really different schools among within Chinese philosophy. Han Feizi, the so-called legalist thinker, for him, order is the most important thing. But Mencius would say, not any order is good. We have to search for good order. And so I think there's a diversity within Chinese philosophy that tends to be neglected when we pose Chinese philosophy in sharp contrast with Western philosophy. I think Chinese philosophy, even Confucianism, is a very rich condition. So it's not that it's probably not very fair to say Chinese philosophy is doing things in a particular kind of way. I guess that's my answer to your first question. Sorry, please remind me the second and third question.
While you were talking about democracy, are you only talking about functional democracy existing in the US or India, or are you also?
Oh, right. Yeah. Thank you. So I think the problems of democracy I raised have don't have any features associated with a specific country, right? I think in any democracy, it relies on one person, one vote, right? But one person, one vote means that non-voters don't have a voice. Then issues that concern with non-voters cannot play a role in national politics, right? Majority tends to suppress the minority. Voters tend not to be rational. I think it applies to anywhere. Of course, Switzerland or Iceland, for that matter, or Denmark are slightly different because they are tiny countries in terms of population. So my worry about democracy is really when the country is too big for common people to understand, then policy making tends to be not reliable through one person, one vote. So in that sense, I think Iceland, Switzerland, or Denmark have advantage. But if when we talk about big countries like Russia, India, the US, France, I think my worry applies. Okay, so that's my response to the second issue. Sorry, the third issue.
Third issue, in your talk, you mentioned that king could be removed in meritocracy.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So. Yeah, so we have these two houses, right? The two houses, I didn't specify how eventually we, have the executive branch. So if we use the kind of British parliamentary system, right? Maybe these two houses can have a vote on the prime minister and all the other ministers, right? But instead of just the one party elected branch to vote for the the prime minister. Now there are two branches that vote for the prime minister, and then just like any parliamentary politics, a prime minister can be removed when he or she loses the majority of the votes of the parliamentarians. So there could be a process to do it, and in that sense, so the way I'm proposing is still the same in line with the sort of parliamentary politics. It's just that there is a different branch of the parliament introduced in my proposal.
Thank you. I appreciate your answer.
Yeah, thank you.
So I see that Professor Alka Acharya's hand is up. And before that, there was Shruti, her hand was up. So can we take Shruti?
Yeah, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Professor. That was a fascinating lecture. And since you mentioned that this model is universally applicable and given the Indian context, my question more relates to the fact that does this model also assume a kind of modern rationality in the sense that India has a lot of diversity? I did not see any mention of that in your model, how to accommodate this kind of diversity, which is more traditional, and also structural inequalities, for example, the caste system. So are those kinds of pre-modern or traditional kinds of diversities also can be accommodated within this model? What is your thought on that? Thank you.
Right. So it really depends on what you mean by diversity. So I think in my design, in spite of all the parents' rejection of equality, deep down it's built on equal opportunities. So every person should be given equal opportunity to try out. So in that sense, any kind of say caste system, or any kind of inborn distinctions among people should be rejected in this regime. So I think that's another reason I said, China entered the form of modernity very early, because I think this idea that we are born to be equal, we are born to have the right to claim even on the kingship. That idea was already widespread in Chinese society around 500 BCE, right? And later the Qin dynasty conquered all other states. The Qin state conquered all other states and founded Qin dynasty, but it didn't last very long. Some peasants rebelled. And in the peasant rebellion, the slogan is that is the king, are the kings, marquis, generals, and ministers of a special breed, special bloodline. So it's a rhetorical question. And I think the peasant rebellions, the peasant rebels are meant to say that they don't come from a special bloodline. If they don't come from a special bloodline, why can I become the king? So I think this idea of equal opportunity has to be established. But at the same time, different kind of diversity, right? People have different, religious beliefs, sexual orientations, and things like that. That diversity should be tolerated. But that's really about the liberal part of liberal democracy. So I mentioned, I personally like the liberal part, so I try to make a regime where the liberal part can be preserved. But in order for that to happen, the democratic part has to be restricted, right? Of course, here the question is, can Confucianism be compatible with the liberal part? So in chapter 9 of my book, I try to argue that Confucianism can be compatible with liberalism. I think the important trick I'm using was really inspired by later John Rawls. John Rawls, in his later writings, in his political liberalism, there he argues that in order for liberal democracy to be embraced by a majority, liberal democracy has to be freed from any metaphysical thick metaphysical reading. So I think that in order for human rights or some kind of pluralism to become a universal, we need to have a kind of thin reading of human rights. If you believe that we are born to have all these rights, then I think not all the people, a lot of people wouldn't accept that argument. So in order for the idea of rights to become universal, you have to allow people to read rights differently. So one mechanism I mentioned is that Confucians clearly don't talk about rights, but they do talk about duties. And duties and rights sometimes are the two sides of the same coin. You can say the child has a right to be raised by his parents. You can also say the parents have a duty to raise the child, right? And both rights and duties can be legally enforced. So, so I think that's how I show the compatibility between Confucianism and liberalism. And then one last point on this. So I argue that Confucianism can be compatible with diversity. However, Confucians also emphasize on some kind of unity. I think a problem of a lot of liberal societies today that too much emphasis is given to diversity, but not enough emphasis is given to unity, right? So a lot of group identities, right? We're all LGBTQ plus, right? We're all Black, we're all Chinese, right? These identities are emphasized, but as a state, there is no state identity, or state identity tends to be ignored, even denounced, right? And then if you think about it, you have all the sub state group identities, but you don't have a state identity, then the state will be dissolved. I think that's pretty dangerous. So I think maybe we should rethink diversity. Diversity is important, but diversity can only survive if there's some kind of unity built into this regime. So that's my view on this topic. So thank you for your question.
Let's have the question from Professor Acharya, and I think it's 7:30 now, so we'll make this the last question.
Right.
Over to you.
Thanks, Ravi, and thank you very much, Professor Pai. I must say, on behalf of the Institute, we express once again our gratitude that you accepted this invitation to deliver the 15th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture, and it's really been quite a challenging kind of set of ideas that you have laid before us. Out of your last set of answers, I think a whole new range of questions come up, and especially when you start to deal with this unity and diversity, because in this country, we have always upheld the concept of unity in diversity. In other words, the idea that we recognize ourselves as belonging to one state, but respecting a very, very diverse set of differences, identities. But anyway, that takes me into another question. I just want you to, as we depart, I want to get a sense from you about the kind of debates that are taking place within China. You did hint that the questions that were raised earlier about how can Confucianism become relevant to China today. I think what I'm wanting to know is whether the nature of your research and your investigations into how we are making Confucianism compatible in the 21st century, how much of a resonance does it have within China? How are scholars within China really, or are they not actually debating these issues in a thoroughgoing fashion? Because I'm not looking at the equivalence between Confucianism and contemporary China. I mean, that would be unhistorical. But I'm trying to see whether the state project of using Confucianism as a tool of soft power, which is, to my mind, a rather cynical way in which the whole corpus of Confucianism is handled, and the use of Confucian ideas integrated into a kind of, let's say, socialism with some Confucian characteristics. Because you're doing it in the economic realm, you are saying Chinese characteristics, but does it really apply in the political realm also? So I just want to get a sense of what you see are the debates that are happening in China.
Right. So first, just a quick comment on the unity through diversity. So I mentioned that idea in my book. I said, but my view is that it's not enough to maintain unity. There has to be something a little bit thicker to have a sense of unity within a state. But that's probably a debate for another talk. And about the Confucian revival, right, or the revival of Chinese traditions in China. I think it's often reported in the Western media that this revival is manipulated by the government in order to spread the soft power. There might be some truth to that claim, but I think that in recent decades, China's economy, in a lot of places with Confucian influences like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, their economies have been developing pretty well, and I think that debunked the so-called Max Weber's thesis that Protestantism is compatible with capitalism, Confucianism is not, right? So I think that removes the obstacle for people to appreciate Confucianism, because they see that Confucianism can be compatible with free market, with capitalist ideas. Then Huntington has this thesis of the clash of civilizations. But again, Taiwan, South Korea, all developed a democracy, right? And in a way, I think they are even more Confucian than mainland China, because mainland China, we went through the Cultural Revolution, so we got rid of a lot of traditions. So South Korea and Taiwan are more traditional societies, and they could become democratic. That shows that this clash of civilization thesis is problematic, to say the least, right? And also the simple fact that now Chinese are richer, and so they become more confident. So what I'm trying to say here is that there is a genuine embrace of traditions among ordinary Chinese people, and scholars as well, right? Scholars realize that maybe Confucianism is not that bad, seeing all what's happening in the world, especially in the sort of the region with heavy Confucian influence. So I think the sympathy with traditions is genuine among a lot of people, and it becomes stronger and stronger. Still, I'm not very optimistic with regard to the present situation. There are people who are on the left and on the right in China. They fight against each other very fiercely, but there's one thing that can unite both the left and the right, is their denunciation of traditions and Confucianism in particular. I think this is just unfortunate, and so it's still a long way. And I think for Confucianism to have a true revival, we need a truly free market of ideas. I think let me just end my remark there. I think I have said enough.
I really appreciate this last comment, that we need a free market of ideas. Let's hope that we move towards that instead of the other kind of free market, which can have rather unfortunate consequences.
Right.
Thank you.
I think, in the West, although it's a kind of apparently it's a liberal democracy, yet a lot of ideas become deep convictions. So they don't really have free market ideas. In authoritarian governments, people are not allowed to freely discuss things. So I think, both liberal and non-liberal countries have their own problems. And in that sense, I think deep down, I'm a liberal. I want to defend the free market of ideas. I think that's quite crucial. And only through this kind of free competition, ideas, be it Confucian or otherwise, can truly succeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. We are now at the end of the lecture, Professor, and I want to thank you for the wonderful experience that you have given us and the range of subjects you have covered, and the frankness and openness with which you have addressed this multitude of questions. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to take these up, fascinating as they are, but I'm sure we will save that for a future occasion. So once again, my thanks to all those who participated and asked the questions. My thanks to Professor Bai. And I will now hand you back to the Master of Ceremonies for the formal vote of thanks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. With this, we would wrap up the session. We express our gratitude to Professor Tongdong Bai for taking time out of his busy schedule and delivering a fascinating lecture. We also thank Dr. Hilal Ahmed for his insightful words that set the tone for the event. Our sincere appreciation also extends to Mr. Ravi Bhutalingam for presiding over the session. Furthermore, we extend our heartfelt thanks to all the attendees for their presence and active participation. We'd also like to acknowledge and express our gratitude to our esteemed co-host, the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, as well as our valued media partner, ThePrint. We are pleased to inform you that today's lecture will be accessible on the ICS YouTube platform. Once again, thank you for your participation and support.
Thank you.